This week, we're going to examine the foreign relations of Latin America from independence in the 1820s until 1930, when the age of exports ended. This issue of Latin America's relationship with foreign powers is really one of the central themes of the region's history. And this week I'll begin by discussing British influence in the region during the 19th century, but we'll spend most of the time examining the United States' influence in Latin America. So Britain, if you remember from a few weeks ago, had significant influence along the Atlantic coast of South America. Britain, for example, negotiated a peace treaty with Argentina and Brazil in the 1820s, which led to the creation of Uruguay. Britain also had a key role in pressuring Brazil to end the Atlantic slave trade by 1850. Indeed, for most of the countries of South America during the 19th century, Britain was South America's most important trader and served as its middleman with the outside world. British merchants dominated the coffee and rubber trade in Brazil, the guano exports in Peru, and the livestock trade in Argentina. But it wasn't just in South America. In the Caribbean and Central America, Britain also had influence. Of course, it held colonial possessions in the Caribbean and Jamaica and Trinidad. But also, here I put a map of Belize. That was called British Honduras during the colonial period. And also along the coast of Nicaragua, the community called Greytown was a colony of Britain as well. And these were strategic places throughout the Americas where Britain could exert its influence. British influence, however, by the late 19th century, starts to decline, and particularly it was World War I that devastated the British Empire. So after World War I, the British Empire starts to disintegrate, and it accelerates during and after World War II. So really, moving forward, after World War I, Britain has very little influence in Latin America. And we'll really be focusing on the United States moving forward. And one more thing about Belize. So it was called British Honduras during the colonial period. And we have not included Belize as a country in Latin America precisely because it was a colony of Britain. Now let's examine the United States, which will remain a major player in Latin American affairs for the remainder of the course. The U.S. policy that established its initial policy towards Latin America was the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, and this was just as Latin America gained independence in the 1820s when this policy was established. And the Monroe Doctrine was declared by President James Monroe, who you see here on the slide. And in 1823, during a State of the Union address, he said that European involvement in the Americas would be seen as an act of aggression towards the United States. And this is the policy that establishes Latin America as the United States' quote, backyard, its sphere of influence. And also, the doctrine said that the United States wouldn't interfere with existing European colonies, and nor would it meddle in the internal concerns of European countries. So this did not threaten Britain at the time, which was still the main player in Latin American foreign affairs. And the primary objective of the Monroe Doctrine was to free the newly independent colonies of Latin America from European intervention. And it wanted to avoid situations in which the New World would become a battleground for old world powers. And also, basically the United States is saying, Europe can't intervene in America and affairs in the Americas, but the United States can, right? This is what is establishing the U.S. as the main player in Latin American affairs. At least it's a policy on paper, and it's going to take many decades before this actually becomes a reality. The doctrine asserted that the New World and the Old World were to remain distinctly separate spheres of influence, and it represented a defining moment for U.S. foreign policy, and it's really one of the longest-standing tenets of American foreign policy. And ever since then, American statesmen and several U.S. presidents, including Ulysses Grant, Theodore Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, they have all invoked the Monroe Doctrine at one point or another to establish that European countries cannot interfere in Latin America. Only the United States can. This is the U.S.'s, quote, backyard and sphere of influence. Another pivotal moment in the United States' relationship with Latin America was the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. So after independence, the political chaos in Mexico resulted in the country's instability to control its northern territories from California to Texas. In the meantime, as you probably remember from your U.S. history courses, the United States was rapidly expanding westwards. And in the 1820s and 30s, American cotton farmers began migrating into Texas. And they came in masse to the point where white Americans outnumbered the Mexicans in Texas by a ratio of 10 to 1 by 1836. And of course, there were conflicts between the new American settlers and the Mexicans in Texas. And this was a time when the Mexican government was led by Santa Anna. And there were numerous conflicts over cultural issues, and many of the American settlers had complaints with the Mexican government. But another big issue was the issue of slavery. And if you remember, a few weeks ago, in 1829, Mexico abolished slavery. And this angered the cotton farmers who had migrated to Texas because they had brought with them 5,000 black slaves. And they considered slavery to be fundamental to the success of the cotton economy. Meanwhile, as this was occurring, the Mexican government worried that there were too many Americans in Texas. And in 1835, Santa Anna forbid any further immigration into the region. And of course, a year later, as you probably remember from your school days growing up in Texas, if you attended public schools in Texas, in 1836, the American colonists declared Texas independent from Mexico. And Santa Anna sent a ragtag army to defeat the rebels, but the rebels were successful in repelling Santa Anna, and in 1836, Texas declares its independence from Mexico. And of course, you know about the Lone Star Republic. For about 10 years, Texas was an independent country. But in 1846, Texas was annexed into the United States. And that is what precipitated the war between the United States and Mexico. And the boundary between Texas and Mexico had never been established very clearly. It was a disputed boundary, and you can see that on the map here. The gray shaded area in South Texas from the Rio Grande, which of course is the current border today, to the Nueces River, where to the north, that was the disputed territory between the United States and Mexico at the time. Mexico claimed that the border went to the Nueces River because that was the historic boundary between Texas and Coahuila, going back to the colonial period. And at this time, President James K. Polk was in office, and he had campaigned on annexing California into the Union, and he was willing to take California by force if it was necessary. And he tried to buy California from Mexico, but Mexico refused. So he needed a war. He needed to start a war with Mexico. And the way he went about doing this is that in 1848, President Polk sent U.S. troops into the disputed territory between the Nueces and Rio Grande River. And he was full aware that that move would provoke a conflict with Mexico. And when American soldiers arrived down at the Rio Grande, that is when Mexican soldiers fired on the American troops. And this is what allowed President Polk to declare a war of defense. I put war of defense in quotes. Because he went before the Senate and claimed that, quote, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood on American soil, end quote. And that's how the war began. It was, the long-term consequences had to do with Mexico losing Texas, then Texas being annexed into the United States, and then the boundary dispute between Mexico and the United States. So the war begins shortly after that in 1846, and it lasts only 2 years, and it was a humiliating defeat for Mexico and a great success for the United States. The U.S. Army invaded from the north and also through the Gulf state of Veracruz, and the U.S. Army would go on to occupy Mexico City for 9 months in 1848. And 20,000 Mexican soldiers were killed in the war, and the U.S. lost about 1,700 troops in battle, but another 11 to 12,000 died due to tropical diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. And if If you want to learn more about the war, I encourage you to take my course on the history of Mexico. We read an entire book about it, but I'll just briefly summarize kind of the reasons for the outcomes of the war. So Mexico lost the war because the country was weak. It was weak and it was divided because of its internal political divisions. We talked about those conflicts between liberals and conservatives during this period. There was really very little sense of nationhood in Mexico that could unite the country against a foreign invader. In addition, we talked about how the economy of Latin America really suffered after independence. And for Mexico, right, the mining economy still languished in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And this prevented the country from developing a truly professional and modern army that could confront the United States. The U.S. had more modern weapons and a more powerful artillery, and this more powerful artillery proved crucial in battle after battle. And also the U.S. troops were well supplied, and they were paid on time as well. And that was not the case with the Mexican troops, who often had low morale, and they weren't paid on time, and they were not well supplied. And the war ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which I think is very important in the history of foreign relations with the United States. And I'll just briefly summarize it here. And the treaty, it ends the war, and it gives the United States California, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Colorado. And the cost that the United States paid $15 million for all those extensive lands, basically pretty much most of the American Southwest today. You can see the shaded area on the map here. And later, in 1853, that very dark gray part in southern Arizona, that was the Gadsden Purchase. It was 30,000 square miles that the United States purchased for $10 million. So in the war, Mexico loses over half of its national territory. We're talking about 525,000 square miles of land that it lost to the United States. And most of the 100,000 Mexicans in the American Southwest, there was about 100,000 Mexicans who lived in that territory that was handed over to the U.S. On paper, they were guaranteed civil rights, and they could become U.S. citizens, which included the right to vote, the right to retain their language, and their religion and culture. And these were kind of principles that were enshrined in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And if you want to learn more about the war, as I said, I encourage you to take my History of Mexico course. But again, it was a pivotal moment in relations between Latin America and the United States. And obviously we can see from this war that it was a war of aggression by the United States. And the United States was an expanding power during these years. And Mexico, one of its themes during these years was also the loss of its national territory.